Hello and welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. My name's Ralph Cree. My website is bodyheartmindspirit.co.uk for more information about my stuff. In this episode, I spoke to Anthony Peake about his book, which you can see here in the background, I just grabbed, called The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, by Anthony Peake. We also talk about some of his other work, including his book called Cheating the Ferryman. So Anthony has written a lot about some subjects which I had some personal experience with, and that's how I got into his work. I had a temporal lobe seizure, which is a kind of epileptic thing where time goes weird and you get lots of deja vu and that kind of thing. A friend of mine had read his book and said, "Oh, you ought to read his book because he speaks a lot about temporal lobe epilepsy." He's got this very interesting hypothesis he calls cheating the ferryman, which in a nutshell is that we never fully reach the moment of death. When we reach the end of our life, we actually relive our life again, kind of Groundhog Day style. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's just kind of the one sentence version. And then his work about the daemon is that we have another part of ourselves called the daemon, who he calls a daemon, which has lived our lives over and over again and knows what's coming in a lot of instances, and that's what deja vu is. So we had quite a wide-ranging conversation. Talked a lot about psychedelics like DMT and ketamine and near-death experiences and the kind of parallels with those things. Anthony's a very interesting guy. He's got an incredible memory. He knows so much about so many things. I'll just read a little bit from his bio just so you get an idea of who he is. So at university, he specialised in sociology of religion, the theory of language development and art of the Italian Renaissance. A postgraduate course in management led Anthony away from his calling as a writer and into a career as a manager in various UK businesses. His interest in the esoteric continued with a growing fascination for quantum physics and neurology developing over the years. It was in the year 2000 that his life was to change. A fortuitous set of circumstances allowed him to take a year sabbatical from his business career, and he decided that he would focus the fruits of all his reading and research into writing a book. Exactly 1 year later, he resurfaced. he surfaced with the manuscript of his first book, then entitled Cheating the Ferryman. This book was a distillation of all his areas of interest: quantum physics, neurology, ancient myths, altered states of consciousness, and the mystery of death. However, it was to take 5 years before this work appeared in print. Thanks to the help of Professor Bruce Grayson of the University of Virginia, an article based on Anthony's Cheating the Ferryman hypothesis was to appear in the winter 2004 edition of the Journal of Near-Death Studies, the academic periodical of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. A few months later, in early 2005, British publishing house Arcturus brought the rights to the book, and a year later, and after a substantial rewrite, Anthony's first book with the new title Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die was published. The rest, as I say, is history. This book has now sold over 60,000 copies worldwide and has been translated into various foreign language editions, including Spanish, Russian, and Polish. Indeed, Anthony has now had books published in every major European language. He's written 8 books, co-authored a 9th, and co-edited a 10th. All of them develop his Cheating the Ferryman hypothesis into ever wider areas of application. His approach has always been to apply science to the mysterious and the enigmatic. So I hope you enjoy this wide-ranging, interesting conversation with Anthony Peake and his bold hypothesis which I find really, really intriguing. Anthony Peake, welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast.
I'm absolutely delighted and really looking forward to our discussion. It's going to be good.
So it's a great pleasure to host you. I understand you're people that know you call you Tony. So
That's
right,
right. Absolutely.
call you Tony.
I have this sort of dual personality whereby Tony is me, the ordinary, humble, normal guy, and Anthony's this egomaniac that gets on stages and storms around and does all things. My wife hates seeing me perform, as she says, because I'm a very different person. So yeah, but I'm Tony today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that actually ties in a little bit with what we're going to be talking about today, that we are more than oneself. So, it's a good thing in life to be able to make use of, be versatile, to use more than one identity. So we're mainly going to be discussing today this book here, which I'll just hold up to the camera, which is called, you've written called the, do you pronounce it Daemon or Daemon?
I pronounce it Daemon to just differentiate. But Daemon, when they spell it with the I, tends to be the pronunciation of Daemon. But I say it as Daemon.
Okay.
I think that's the correct pronunciation, I think, from my knowledge of Greek.
Okay, so it's called The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self by Anthony Peake. And I'd never heard of your work before until a couple of years ago. And the reason why I came across your work is I had something called a temporal lobe seizure, so an epileptic seizure. So for those listening who haven't heard of a temporal lobe seizure, I'd never heard of one. It's a kind of mini epileptic seizure in the region of your brain called the temporal lobes, which are to do with time perception. And I'll get into the experience I had in a bit to describe that. But I had that experience, and there's another experience which is slightly different, which I'll get into as well. But a friend of mine, when he heard that I'd had this experience, he said, "Oh, you need to read this book. I've just read this book by this chap Anthony Peake, and it speaks a lot about temporal lobe seizures." So I thought, well, I had to be a little bit careful. The temporal lobe seizure really freaked me out. It was a very disorienting experience, and there was quite an unpleasant dimension to it. So I was not. I was like, I had to be quite careful afterwards. I became a bit hyper vigilant of deja vu, synchronicities, these kind of things. And I was like, so I kind of didn't rush into reading your book. I took my time, and then when I started reading it, I read it very slowly. As soon as I felt like, well, this is too much, it's kind of bringing it all back up, I had to kind of like take my foot. So I read it very, very slowly over probably 6 months or something like that. So that's how I came across your work, and I've listened. You've got tons and tons of stuff on YouTube, and podcasts and those kind of things. So I've listened to quite a lot of that. The first thing I wanted to say is that, to set this up, is I'm someone who will freely admit I have not got a clue what is going on in life. I just do not know. It's a complete mystery to me. That's my kind of starting point with everything. But I have to say, I love a bold hypothesis and playing around with ideas. And I find your hypotheses, which we're going to look at today, or do you call them theories? A difference in hypothesis or theories.
No, I definitely don't call them theories. I use very much the scientific definition of these things. I would argue that it is at best a hypothesis, or the hypotheses, but it is just as much speculation as anything else, in the sense that it is to a degree unproven scientifically, in that it is virtually impossible to reproduce a lot of the things I discuss under controlled laboratory conditions. However, I will argue that the speculation and the hypotheses work when I interface with individuals like you, who, through the phenomenological experiences you have had and the experiential experiences you have, your experiences prove and support totally the ideas I put forward in my models. So for me, I tend to use the word probably hypothesis, but even that I'm ill at ease, but it's not a theory yet. Maybe one day in the future we'll find ways and means whereby we can do that, but not at the moment.
Yeah, sure. And there was an instant recognition when I came across your hypotheses and I was reading about them. I was like, there was a recognition there, for sure. And I think one of the things that over the years I've been kind of reoriented my view, going against the grain of my education and stuff, that I actually now take my direct experience and the direct experience of other people seriously. We're kind of in the schooling in England and Europe and America, so kind of the modern secular world, we're very much trained to doubt our direct experience, and which I think is there's a valid point there, but it's also a great mistake to discount your own direct experience, because really that's the main thing you got in your life. So
well, that's the central argument I use in a number of my books, is that really everything we experience is subjective. Everything we experience is presented to consciousness by the brain or by something that internally models the external world and the stimuli that's coming in through our senses. And anybody, there is a term that is used by consciousness studies individuals and researchers called naive realism. And naive realism is the idea that there is somehow a one-to-one relationship between the stimuli, or the qualia, to use a technical term, that my brain presents to my consciousness with what is actually out there. Because we know from consciousness studies that, for example, the whole visual system that we see is created by the brain from a postage stamp inverted image on the retina, which is converted from photon electromagnetic energy into an electrical stimuli, which goes through the optic nerve down to the darkest part of the brain, the place at the back of the brain. And there it takes those images and recreates that postage stamp inverted image and turns it into this three-dimensional world. And then it's presented to whatever consciousness is. It's extremely peculiar, isn't it? The idea that there is something inside your head that is created from the interaction of energy and chemistry and everything else, that somehow at its lowest level is not only inanimate, but it is dead, because they are chemicals. And these chemicals somehow come together in some form of configuration that creates a sentient being that has a history, has anticipations, has hopes, and has dreams. And of course, this is impossible. It is impossible as anything you can imagine. And yet modern science readily just accepts this. It's hubris. It's the idea of, I think it was in 1994, a young Australian philosopher called David Chalmers stood up at the University of Arizona at a big consciousness conference and said, of course, modern science, there is the soft problem of science, which is how the brain functions. But the hard problem is how it creates consciousness. As I've said in one of my books, is it just the addition of one quark? Is it the addition of one electron, one photon, and suddenly consciousness just suddenly downloads from nowhere? It's extraordinary. And I always find that people never think that further back. In other words, we have this beautiful materialist reductionist explanatory model of reality. And, we know that it works because, in order to understand how a system works, you take it apart bit by bit. And then by reducing it, materially reducing it, you understand how it functions. You can't do that with consciousness. You can't do that with the way the brain works. It's just not possible, really.
Yeah, well, that's a good place to start. Idealism is been quite a theme recently on my podcast, and we won't get into that because that's quite a nuanced topic. But what is conscious, the fact that consciousness can never be made into an object of study, truly, that is a very, very difficult problem for an objectively oriented discipline like science. So that's who knows, I mean, there's maybe a completely new way of approaching things which is utterly inconceivable to us now, but at the moment we are where we are. Well, let's get into it. So I thought it'd be good to start with if you do a brief description of this dyad between what you call the Eidolon and the Daemon, which is kind of two main aspects of who we are. I believe there is a sort of a third component that we might get into later in the conversation, but just at the moment restrict it to those two. And then how that links up with your hypothesis, which you call Cheating the Ferryman, which was from an earlier book you wrote. And I think the challenge for you is to make this into the kind of elevator speech version, because I have had the experience of setting this kind of thing up before in a podcast, and suddenly half the time's gone.
I will try and reduce it. I think I'm like Mission Impossible. You wish.
If you wish to accept it,
is this? You have to succinctly describe your hypothesis in 10 minutes or less, and this message will now destruct. So Ethan, it's up to you. Effectively, very, very quickly, I would argue that the greatest mystery we have is what happens to human consciousness at the point of death. It is the ultimate mystery, and it is something that has engaged philosophers, scientists, and many other people for millennia, because inevitably we are all sentient beings that are going to die. And the question is, what happens at death? Because it's one thing we know for certain. Death and taxes are the two things that we know with certitude. So I was very interested in this model, but I was interested in coming up with a hypothesis that made rational sense to science. Something that couldn't be scientifically dismissed, because so many of the models depend upon mysticism and the idea of spirit and everything else as well. But I wanted a model that scientists couldn't just diss in any way at all. And in fact, what they haven't done, they haven't dissed it. They've just completely ignored it. And I think that's probably the reason why it has been completely ignored, because it is so difficult to dismiss as a scientist. Okay, so what I argue, and again, it is interesting, I use the analogy that when I came across my Cheating the Ferryman hypothesis, it was not my intention to come up with a hypothesis explaining life after death. I wanted to explain deja vu. I wanted to explain what deja vu was as a phenomenon and what caused it. And it was only through starting research I felt I was rather like Schliemann when he was discovering Troy in the Hill of Hissarlik. Frederick Schliemann had an idea that Troy was somewhere probably in northwestern Turkey, as it is now, but he didn't know where it was. So he arbitrarily picked this hill, started digging, and then he started to find all the different levels of Troy there. And I felt I was like that. I was excavating this hypothesis. I wasn't discovering it. I wasn't creating it. I was excavating it. And more information kept coming to me as I started to read up. So I didn't start off with a model and think, I'll go out and prove it. I did quite the opposite. I started out with no idea where I was going. And I ended up with this incredible, I believe, hypothesis that to me is totally revolutionary. Okay. So the model basically, and this will then explain the Daemon and the Eidolon dyad and how that works. So you need the first model. Now, again, just to explain, in 2020, I brought out a new version of all the new science that supported my hypothesis, which I actually called Cheating the Ferryman. And that book came out in 2020. So if anybody's interested in the latest research supporting my ideas, you'll find that there. Okay. So the first thing is that there's something called near-death experiences, NDEs. And in NDEs, there are certain traits that were put together by a guy called Raymond Moody. And people, when they describe near-death experiences, that's close brushes with death, they describe certain things that are consistent. And some of them are really quite interesting. People, for instance, say that time seems to dilate when you get into a near-death experience. People seem to have what's called a panoramic life review, where they see, quote, my life flash before my eyes. They also feel they have a sensation, an out-of-body experience, where they're floating above their body, looking down at their body. They also encounter a tunnel. They also go to another place, another reality that seems to be a facsimile of this one. But they also deal and come across something called the being of light, which seems to be an entity that manifests to assist the dying person in the transfer over to whatever comes after death. And this model is very similar, as you know from your work at SOAS and your work with anthropology. It's very similar to the shamanistic worldview and the way in which the shamanistic guide appears to people when they're in shamanic traveling. Also, when people have experiences with dimethyltryptamine and other entheogens. So there's a lot of these things. So what I suggest is I started looking into this. Well, is there a neurological model that can be applied to this? And I was surprised to discover that yes, there is. And it is neurological. The near-death experience is created by the brain. But that doesn't explain it. Just like when we were discussing earlier on, neurology cannot explain consciousness in the same token. It's an experience. So people report that they have all these sensations. And I started to pull it together and I thought, well, what could this mean? And I was particularly interested in this idea of my life flashing before my eyes. So I started looking into the processes of memory, how memory is processed, how the brain encodes memory. And I was surprised to discover that according to the latest research, it seems that memory works holographically. It seems it's not located in one place in the brain. It's located everywhere in the brain. And it's processed almost non-locally, to use a quantum physics term. There seems to be instantaneous communication across various areas of the brain, which, funnily enough, has recently been proven in some research that was done at the University of Sussex about 3 or 4 years ago, which we might touch a little bit upon. But,
another place I went to university, actually, briefly.
Oh, really? It's just down the road from here. So
Yeah.
I live in West Sussex. So lovely location, lovely location. So so neurologically, what's taking place? Because people, when they have these panoramic life reviews, seem to be catapulted right back into a recreation of an element of their past, where they say, you know, I saw my whole life flash before my eyes. But some people argue that they don't just have their own flash before their eyes, they actually relive those moments. And I do my background research. I cite a lot of the work of a guy called Wilder Penfield, who was an American stroke Canadian. Well, he was based in Canada, but he was an American neurosurgeon who in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s did a series of experiments on the exposed brains of individuals, mostly epileptics, because they were wanting to model what happened in the brain when somebody had a seizure and such like. And what he found was that if he placed, what he knew was that the brain doesn't feel pain. So you can expose the cerebral cortex of a person with local anesthetic, and you can stimulate the surface of the brain using it with a small electric pen, and it will put an electric charge into the surface of the brain. And it will make people feel things. They'll see colors, they'll see lights. And he was able to describe an homunculus which shows which parts of the brain generate which senses, which was interesting. But he worked his way round to the brain till he got to the temporal lobes. And when he placed the electrode onto the exposed temporal lobes of people, he was able to evoke past life memories, 3-dimensional holographic past life memories, which were evoked instantaneously. The person
when you say past life memories, do you mean autobiographical memories, or are you talking about memories of what seemed to be like different lives?
No, specific autobiographical memories.
Specific autobiographical ones.
Because
Right.
my model can explain that as well,
Sure.
ultimately.
Yeah.
But at that time, they were purely autobiographical. For instance, there was one classic example where he places the electrode on this woman's brain, and she goes, "Oh my God, I'm back in my kitchen 20 years ago or whatever." And she could hear a conversation her next door neighbors were having, literally word for word. Then she hears her son calling her. And what Penfield did is he took the electrode off the exposed temporal lobes of this person, and she said, "What did you just do?" It stopped. And he distracted her, spoke about her son, and then without her knowing, he placed the electrode back on the same point and took her back to the point again. She said, "What did you just do?" The memories are back again.
Wow.
Now, he reproduced this many, many times, and towards the end of his career, he argued that the human brain actually records every single sensation we have, but we can't access it. And as Penfield said, what is the principle of the brain using all this processing power to have memories that we can't recall? As you know, we have episodic memories. We have what's called charge memories. These are sometimes, where suddenly you'll be walking along the street and then suddenly, for no reason whatsoever, you're catapulted back to a period of your past and you just remember it. And it's normally completely arbitrary. It's not a moment in your past whereby somebody gave you news that your family had died. It's normally a really prosaic incident in your past. Now, Esther Salomon, who was a Russian psychologist, called these things charged memories. And in fact, in her book, her book is called A Series of Moments, which is about how life is just a series of moments that are linked by our life narrative. Okay. And they concluded that we seem to remember everything, but we can't access it under normal circumstances. Now, we know that these memories can be accessed using hypnotism because, for instance, in the book, I cite evidence from people taking hypnotic regression, where they can regress somebody back to a point in the past. Like, for instance, I did an event last year, and I will be doing another event in the Coachella Valley in California in a few weeks' time. And there was an incident that took place there, I think, in 1973, where a group of school kids were hijacked, and the driver was kicked out the bus, and the bad guys drove these kids out into the desert, and they buried the bus and kept the kids in the bus, which is an aside story. But they needed to find out more about what happened during the incident. Because they had the driver, they hypnotized the driver back to the time when he was driving the bus. And the driver was able to recall the car coming in front and recall the number plate of the car. And from the number plate, they were able to then go, find out, and rescue the kids. Now, this means, again, that we have memories that are there and are active, but we can't access them. So keep that in mind. So we have all our life memories in 3 dimensions that can be recreated, like a simulation, like a virtual reality version of your life, that you really think you're living it again. Now, the other thing I said in near-death experiences were that people have panoramic life reviews, where they see their life flash before their eyes. Then we have the issue I mentioned about time slowing down during incidents of fear or great stress. Like, I cite a lot of examples of the work of a guy called Albert Heim, who was a mountaineer in the 1890s in Zurich. And he did research on people who'd fallen off mountains, mountaineers who'd survived. And the vast majority had panoramic life reviews as they were falling. They nearly all reported they saw their past life in detail. So I thought to myself, wait a minute, what if we link all these things, the time slows down, and it slows down to such an extent that in the final second of your life, you could live a whole lifetime. So imagine, final second is 20 years. Now, the reason I mention this, again, is of great interest to you, I would imagine, is the reason I came to this conclusion was, again, I have a term called synchronicity, whereby circumstances just seem to come to me when I need somebody. They appear in my life and they will give me information I need. And this is a really true story. I was working home in Horsham, where I was living at the time, And I'd started writing the book and I didn't know where I was going with it. And I got particularly interested in deja vu. The phone rings, pick up the phone, and it's a recruitment consultant. Now, I used to work as a management consultant, compensation and benefits. And this lady phoned up. She was from an agency. And she said, Tony, I don't know if you're available for work, but I've got a potential contract for you that you might be interested in. And I said, well, yes, I'd love to be, but I'm taking time out because I'm writing a book. And she said, what are you writing about? And I said, well, I don't know where I'm going with it at the moment, but I'm really fascinated by temporal lobe epilepsy at the moment. It seems to be the driving thing is I'm focusing in on the neurochemical correlates of temporal lobe epilepsy. And she went really quiet and she said, can we meet up for a coffee? And I said yes. And I met her at the Copthorne Hotel near Gatwick Airport. And I met her and I walked in. She bought me a cup of coffee and she said, I couldn't mention in the office, but recently I've been diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy. And everything you were telling me, I've experienced. And I said, please tell me, how did you first discover it? And this is just extraordinary. She said it was the most weirdest event of her life. She was going to see a business client and she was in their canteen. And the business client went up, bought some tea, sat down. And as the business client sitting opposite the table, my friend who I call Margaret, it's a pseudonym, and Margaret is sitting and she feels a snap over her ear. And she looks out and the other woman had stopped moving. She'd literally stopped moving. And she could hear this low humming sound. And then she's looking around and she's going, what the hell has happened? And then she looks at the other woman again and she realizes she hadn't stopped. She was moving incredibly slowly. And she said to me, she said, and this was so important, she said to me, I watched as the tea came out the teapot, the spout came down really slowly. I saw the surface tension as the tea hit the surface of the cup. And she said, I could have been there for days, weeks, months, years, a lifetime. I have no idea how long I was away for. Then there was a snap over her ear. The person continued pouring the tea, looked back and said, are you okay? She'd had a petty malabsence. She'd been away for 0.5 of a second. But she said it could have been a whole lifetime. And then I turned around to her and I said, and I just, so it must have been my Daemon, which will explanation. I turned around to her and said, do you get deja vus? And she said, my God, I get deja vus to die for. And I thought her wording was fascinating. And she said, I have deja vus that I know what's going to happen for the next 2 seconds, maybe. And I'll come back to that later. So I then put that together and I thought, maybe when we die, we go into a temporal lobe seizure whereby time dilates. And the last second of your life could be a lifetime. So what would fill a whole lifetime? Panoramic life review. So what if the panoramic life review that near-death experiencers have is literally a fast forward of a recording of your life? Because everybody says, I saw it flash in front of my eyes. Imagine that in a real death experience, the life doesn't flash. It's literally a minute-by-minute recreation of your life from the moment of your birth to the moment of your death or your death circumstances. So what evidence would we have that when you're living that second life, that that's true? And I'd argue we have absolute evidence for it. 70% of the population of this planet have evidence for it. It's called deja vu. Or more accurately, deja vécu, already lived. Because if you are living your life again in a simulation of your life, there will be times when you'll come across a set of circumstances that you've lived before, that you remember from your previous life. And that's a deja vu. It's exactly what it says on the tin. It's exactly what people describe when they say, I felt that I'd been there before. I had done this before, and maybe many, many times. Now, what is even more intriguing is that I have people who have contacted me subsequently that not only have deja vu sensations as part of their pre-aura seizure of people who have migraine and people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, but also these individuals tell me they know what's going to happen next. And there's one young guy who is literally a rocket scientist who contacted me. And he said to me, he has a tumor on his pineal gland. And he said he had deja vus whereby he knows what's going to happen for the next 10 or 15 seconds. I then asked him and said, well, why don't you do something? Why don't you say something? And he said something very pertinent. He said, if I did, I'd change the future. And he said to me, he said, for instance, if I'm having a deja vu now and I know what you're about to say next, if I turn around to you and say, this is what you're going to say, you're not going to say it. You'll say something completely different. So I've changed the future. And this is when I start bringing in Everett's many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, the idea of multiple universes, the idea of Stephen Hawking and Thomas Hertog's top-down hypothesis of quantum mechanics and cosmology. So the evidence is that we live our lives again. Now, again, I used to do a regular radio program on BBC Radio Merseyside, and I did a program on deja vu, and somebody phoned in. This is fascinating. Somebody phoned in live, and they said, what that person's talking about on the radio is so true. And then what happened? This guy, he was watching TV, and he knew what was going to be said next on the television. And he walked out of the living room, left his wife in the living room, walked out the living room, and then he had a glass front door, and he said he watched somebody walk past, and then somebody walked past again. And then he went upstairs and realized he could prove that he was perceiving the future. So what he did was, and it's fascinating, he went back downstairs and stood outside of the living room door until he knew what his wife would say when he walked in through the door, wrote it down on a piece of paper, folded it, walked it in. She said the words, and he handed her the piece of paper. That to me is absolute evidence, if ever you needed it, that deja vu can be precognitive. Not all deja vus are precognitive, but some of them can be. So we then have the idea we're living our lives again and again and again, because I argue at the end of the second life, the same thing happens. So what happens in reality is we cheat the ferryman. We never die. You know, the old Greek legend is that you have an oboli, which is a small coin that was placed under the tongue of the corpse or over the eyes of the corpse. That was to pay Charon the ferryman to take you over to as a shade into the land of the dead, in the Elysian fields. And you had to pay the ferryman. I believe you cheat the ferryman. We all cheat the ferryman. We never get there. We never pay him. And again, it's fascinating that in Greek legend, when you went the other side, you could also go back and live your life again. You had to drink from what was called the river of forgetting, the river Lethe, and you would drink water, which would wipe all your memories clean, and you'd go back and live your life again. So this is a known thing, and it's been known throughout history. So what I then argue is we live our lives over and over again. And at the end of each life is then in a smaller piece of time, you live your life again. But it gets more complex than that. And this is where we bring the Daemon in. Because I use the analogy of a third-person computer game. Okay. Remember years ago, Lara Croft, you'd play Tomb Raider. What happens is you start Tomb Raider, you switch the computer on, and imagine a virtual reality version of Tomb Raider where you know you're Lara Croft on the screen, but you can also see around. Okay. Switch on. Lara Croft is born. She's what I call an Eidolon. She's living the first life. Her consciousness has just started at the point of her birth, or when the machine pitch switches are on. You make her, as the game player, run down a corridor, go into a room, and a big monster comes out and kills her. So what happens in the gameplay then? You start the game again, don't you? Your on-screen entity has died, your Eidolon has died, and you start the game again. And you start her life again as a brand new Eidolon who has no memory of her previous experiences. But you, as the game player, now have some memories of the previous life. So you guide the Eidolon on screen to not go into that room where the monster is. And you go down another corridor and you get eaten by another monster. Come back to the start. This, I believe, is what is life. Life is a virtual reality simulation of your life that contains the outcome of every single decision you can possibly make. It's already programmed in there. And again, if people are going to be turning around and saying, oh, this is utter kike, it's quantum mechanics. It's exactly Stephen Hawking in his top-down hypothesis, the last paper he wrote, he argued that everything that can happen is already programmed in to the universe digitally, mathematically. And all we do is we collapse the wave function of the particular reality that will anticipate and accommodate our decisions. Now, again, if you know from quantum mechanics, all subatomic particles are either waves or particles. And when they're a wave, they are a statistical wave. They don't have any tangible existence. They are a mathematical statistical wave until they are observed. And when they're observed or measured, the physicists call it collapsing the wave function, which means an anticipatory potential becomes a point particle located in one position or another. I believe this is how consciousness reacts to the external reality. It collapses the wave function to fulfill your decision. So your decision now might be, this Tony Peake, he's talking a load of rubbish. And you get up and you storm off. And you create a new reality. Now moving back, imagine the scenario that you're dying and you're playing your game as an Eidolon. The part of you that is your game player that remembers you've lived this before is your Daemon. Your Daemon is your immortal you. Your Daemon is the version of you that's outside of the game that plays each game. And each game, it learns more about your life. And each game, it knows more about its environment, and it can move the Eidolon to new lives, to new locations. I mean, I'd argue, for instance, there'll be people out there, and I'm sure you've had that sentence. You meet somebody for the first time, and you know them. And you know they're going to have a great influence on you for good or evil. And there's this little voice in your head that's going, stay away from this person, or try and find this person out. And occasionally we have glitches in the matrix where we remember, or what actually I argue is it's to do again with the structures of the brain. Deja vu is effectively you as an Eidolonic consciousness, which ordinarily is in the dominant hemisphere of the brain, accesses the information field available to the Daemon, which is in the non-dominant hemisphere. It's like feedback going across the corpus callosum. And you suddenly get this memory and sudden recognition. And you're accessing your own higher self's thought patterns. So the Daemon and the Eidolon are both you. In fact, the immortal you is the Daemon. Now, where do I get these terms from? The Daemon and the Eidolon are specific terms I use. They are from ancient Greek, which then moved into the Gnostics, which were a schismatic Christian group in the first few centuries after the death of Christ. They had the concept of the Daemon and the Eidolon. They argue that you have your own immortal self, and you have this self that just lives life linearly. They're the terms they used. Eidolon comes from the Greek eidos or eidolos, which means icon, same root word as in icon, as in iconography. And Eidolon is literally a facsimile copy, and it's a facsimile copy of the immortal you, which is the Daemon. Now, again, in my book, The Daemon, as you know, I discuss in great detail how this model can be found in virtually every single culture on the planet. And in fact, not only this, but this model is the thing that people in esoteric teachings are taught. I've had access to a lot of magical groups that do magic, proper magic. And they've approached me and said, my God, do you know your book has actually explained our models? There's a group called the Servants of the Light, as an example. This is something that is known. This is something that has been known for millennia. And I'm writing about it now, but I'm linking it now to science. And I am the only person on the planet that's doing this. And that's why I'm ignored.
Wow. Okay. So, well done for laying that out like that. That's you've done a good job there. So, people listening or watching this, they've got this. This is the context I'm talking about, and a couple of things to mention. From my own experience, one of the things that I read when I came across your work, some of the things that seem unusual about it, like this thing about time, the very, very subjective nature of time, that subjectively you can experience eternity in a moment. There was a time in my life where I was quite into using ketamine, and
Yes.
now that lasts about 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes maximum. And at the end of it, you're completely back to normal. But within that 10-20 minutes, you are completely transformed. It was, it was the first time I had ever completely disappeared, but still been there. Everything in the external world had gone completely, apart from light. It's just sort of this really gorgeous light, and I was there and still there, and it was all very, very peaceful and stuff. I mean, I've had experience where I've seen all sorts of bizarre things as well. You do see things, but ketamine's very unlike any other psychedelic. It's I heard someone describe it, if psychedelics were a kind of family, this is the kind of weird uncle, a bit like I don't know, Radagast in Lord of the Rings, that kind of crazy wizard that's got hair full of bird poop and stuff. So, if I talk about one particular incident, it's quite a nice thing to put on music when you do ketamine. Music's incredible on ketamine. And I put on a piece of music that I knew lasted about 18 minutes. And I experienced it. It felt like eternity. It's just absolutely, eons of time. But then when it was all over, I knew it had only been 18 minutes maximum, because of the length of this song. So I know that your own direct experience of time can be so massively changed, that's part of your hypothesis.
Well, what is particularly interesting here, I'll put in very much for a second, and I'll let you continue. But ketamine, there was a neurophysiologist at the Maudsley Hospital who, in the late 90s, wrote a paper on ketamine and its association with the near-death experience. And he argued that a low ketamine is a horse tranquilizer effectively and is synthetic. Its chemical structure is very similar. It works with the NMDA receptors in the brain. And he argued, I can't think of his surname now. It'll come to me. And it was a very influential paper because he was the first person to argue that the near-death experience has so many similarities with the ketamine experience. And it's extraordinary. And in my latest book, which I'm literally finishing the next day or two, I focus in on this in greater detail, the neurophysiological aspects of this. So ketamine, people have told me, you have you have panoramic life reviews, you have time freezing, you have all these incredible sensations that make you realize that the brain processes reality, and certain substances can then play around with that processing and open up all kinds of vistas that you are not aware of. And to just argue it's an hallucination, I wrote a book called Opening the Doors of Perception a few years ago. And I argued, when people turn around and dismiss it and say, it's an hallucination, that explains nothing. It's a label. I call it the labeling theory of science. The idea, give it a nice name, make it Latin or Greek, and it sounds even more impressive. In fact, I call it idiomatic science, in that, if you have idiomatic, no, my brain's gone now. Yeah, but it's the idea that if you have an illness that has idiomatic on it, on the front, what the doctors are actually saying is they don't understand it. They have no idea what it is. And it's the same with hallucinations. Until we know what a hallucination is, how can we say that hallucination is anything but an alternate perception, that's an alternate reality?
Yeah.
That the brain is processing. We argue that the definition of an hallucination is that it's one person. But if two people share a hallucination, they've got a wonderful term for that. They call it a folie à deux.
Yeah.
But they can't explain
it. Going back to your, you were talking about naive realism at the beginning of this conversation.
Idiopathic, that's the word.
Idiopathic. Yes, idiopathic. That's right. Yeah. when contemplating things like naive realism, most of everything is a hallucination anyway. So I think what I'll do is I'll just describe my temporal lobe seizure, because it kind of ties in quite a lot with this stuff. So as I said, I'd never heard, this happened a couple of years ago. I'd never heard of temporal lobe epilepsy or those kind of seizures. Didn't even know we had a part of the brain called the temporal lobe. But I have had a lot of deja vu in my life, tons of it. And some really like long ones, where almost where you feel like, you could just describe what's just, this is, but you never quite gets on the tip of your tongue. Interesting. My wife said she's never experienced deja vu. So, I don't know what it's like.
She's not done that because she's a first timer.
Maybe,
She's in what we call the virgin life. People who don't have deja vu, the 30% of people don't experience it.
Right. So I think when you've I wonder what it's like, because I don't know what it's like to have never experienced deja vu. But for anyone listening or watching, if you've never experienced deja vu, it's not like you vaguely feel like this moment's happened before. It's actually this has happened before, and it's unfolding, and you're just completely awestruck. It's just the most extraordinary thing. So there's nothing metaphorical about it. And the word deja vu's become quite, if something happens again, you're back in the same pub having the same conversation with somebody, like, oh, deja vu, we're back here. It's become quite lax in common parlance, but we're talking strict.
Very important here as well to make a differential is that is not that version. The version they use there is not deja vu. The definition of deja vu, which was put forward by a guy called he's based in Seattle. It'll come to me again. Vernon Neppe. And Vernon Neppe is Professor Vernon Neppe. And I'm paraphrasing it now, but the definition of deja vu is a memory of an event or a series of events that took place in an undefinable period in your past. So in other words, it's undefinable. In other words, you can't remember, oh, we're back in the pub again. Specifically, you don't remember where you remember it from. And that's so important. So please go on.
Yeah. I've also, since the age of 19, had regular classic migraines. Where you get the kind of shimmering rainbow lattice
where you get the
appears.
The
first time that happened to me when I was 19, this little thing appeared, and then it just grew, and all of a sudden half of my visual field had disappeared, and it was just a shimmering lattice of rainbow colours. And I said to my friend, oh, this is weird things happening. And he said, oh, in about an hour you're going to get a really bad headache. And I was like, oh yeah, whatever. And then I did. And I've had them about 4 a year ever since then. And I think stress is a trigger. But one of the things, I was talking to a doctor friend of mine about temporal lobe seizures and an epilepsy, and she said they're kind of like, the migraines are like baby versions of these. It's on a continuum.
Yeah, it's what I call, again, I'm sorry I keep jumping in here.
Fine.
In my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I present what I call the Huxleyan spectrum. And the Huxleyan spectrum explains very precisely the neurological correlates of classic migraine. As classic migraine moves into a temporal lobe epilepsy. Temporal lobe epilepsy, then at its extreme levels, moves into schizophrenia. And there are overlapping areas for each of them where you're experiencing, and what is happening is, I argue that the doors of perception are being opened more and more. Each level triggers. Now, again, I work with, and have worked with many years now, a number of temporal people who experience, I always try to use the term people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy. And one of them is a guy called Myron Dial, who's a very famous American artist. And he has been experiencing temporal lobe epilepsy since he was 6 years old. And by the way, he has a daemon, and his daemon is called Charon, which we'll discuss later, because I also argue that what you're doing is when you're on the Huxleyan spectrum, your doors of perception are opening and the daemon is more imminent in your life. The daemon can more instruct because it can manifest more. I also argue, and I'm bringing into here autism, Gershwin syndrome, and what's the other thing that I think is particularly relevant to this is dementia and Alzheimer's.
My mum has really advanced Alzheimer's at the moment. I mean, she's had it for about eight years. I think she's pretty much at the end of her life. We're kind of expecting her to die. I don't know, in a few months or something like that.
Killed my mother as well. Yeah.
Yes, I know. I'm reading your book. Your mum had Alzheimer's. Yeah.
So going back,
so there's so many synchronicities with reading your book. It's a bit crazy, really. So yeah, the other experience I will get into after I've described this one is I've had a couple of schizophrenic experience, thankfully short-lived schizophrenic episodes. So I'm right along your spectrum of yeah.
So going back to the TLE,
yes. So the temporal lobe epilepsy,
classic migraine.
Yeah, classic migraine. Never heard of these temporal lobe epilepsy things, but I had a lot of deja vu. So I was cooking supper, started having deja vu, didn't think much of it because, you know, that had happened quite a lot before, but this didn't stop. And I started to think, you know, I don't know, this is a little bit weird. And I was, you know, making supper for my wife and kids, took it out to them, and I said, I've been having deja vu now for like 5 minutes non-stop. And they were like, okay, all right, you know, what is and I said, I'm okay, but it's just a bit weird. And then, you know, was eating my supper, didn't stop. I play a musical instrument called a kora, which is an African harp lute instrument. Started playing that, kind of to calm me down, I think, but it didn't stop. And I had 30 minutes of non-stop deja vu, which that was pretty disconcerting. And then I had this period of just it was like a cascade of memories. So you know that feeling where you're remembering a dream. You say you suddenly remember the dream you had last night. You know, oh whoa, and I was doing blah 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 blah. I call it a cascade because it was almost felt like I was downloading just so rapidly. It was tons and tons of memories, hundreds of memories, but they all had that flavor of remembering a dream. It was like remembering a dream I'd had. That was the flavor of it. And most of them were not autobiographical. They had nothing to do with my life. Completely unfamiliar scenes and things. And it wasn't like I was remembering bits of my life, which was odd. And also some of them were abstract things, like abstract patterns and things that had the flavor of remembering things, which was really weird. Then and apparently I later learned this is a classic symptom of temporal lobe epilepsy. I felt like the world was going to end any second. They call it the sense of impending doom. I mean, I was certain that I'm not talking about like a nuclear bomb. I'm talking about the fabric of reality ripping apart type of thing. And it was not a nice feeling. I was kind of bracing myself for this, really worried about my family and, you know, everyone I loved. And I was like, oh my, you know, but I didn't quite know how to. I think I was saying, I think something right, really. I probably didn't say that out loud. I didn't want to worry my kids, but it was a horrible feeling. And this is when I said earlier that I was a bit kind of shaken up by this experience. All the deja vu and the weird memories and all that stuff were disconcerting, but this was the thing that really freaked me out. Was that feeling that everything's going to end, right? You know, in the next minute. Then I had this surge, a rush through my body. It went down, whoosh, through my body, and I suddenly was like, "Oh my god, I'm going to throw up!" And I ran to the toilet. Nothing. I wasn't actually sick. Nothing came out. And so I was left at the end of this experience. The whole thing was like sort of 30, 35 minutes or whatever. I didn't know what on earth had just happened. And I just said, I've got to go and lie down and just kind of relax, because I just did have this experience. I don't quite know what on earth it was. When I was lying down, my wife sent me a message saying that she'd looked up on Google and found this thing called temporal lobe epilepsy. And she said it sounds exactly like my wife's a real researcher. She always loves getting on and looking things up. And I was reading these descriptions, these people. I was like, whoa, that's exactly what happened. And so then I phoned a doctor, went to see a neurologist, talked to him, had an MRI scan, epilepsy, one of the tests where you wear electrodes all over your scalp for 24 hours and those kind of things. Nothing came up, thankfully. I didn't have any of those. I didn't have a brain tumor or those kind of things, which was, I was a bit worried I had something like that. So, and then this friend of mine, I was told them about that. They said, "Oh, you should read this book, that you'd written, the Daemon." And so, as I say, I put off because I became hyper vigilant of deja vu, because, as you say, the deja vu is an aura of a seizure. And for those listening, an aura is when you're about to have a migraine or a seizure, you start to some phenomena happens. Like with the migraine, you get this shimmering thing in your visual field. At that moment, if I take a couple of paracetamol and lie down in a dark room, I can actually stop a migraine from happening. I've got to act really early on. So when I was having deja vu, I was like, "Oh man, is this going to turn into a seizure?" And I became honestly quite paranoid about deja vu. And since then, I've had quite a lot of some large deja vu moments where it's felt like, "Oh, now this could go into a seizure." But what I do is I reckon in that moment, if I just stop everything I do, go and relax somewhere, and it doesn't go any further. So that's my my temporal lobe seizure. A lot of the descriptions I read in your book, for example, some people have some really awesome experiences with temporal lobe epilepsy, and they have all sorts of blissful experiences. I wouldn't say mine was like that. It was more kind of interesting, but it had this horrible flavour of doom to it. But there you go. That's my my seizure.
There were so many important points you were making there. I mean, I have suffered, for want of a better term, classic migraine for most of my life. And like you, I get the scotoma, I get the breakdown in my visual field, and I get the sensation of deja vu. And I sense I know what's going to happen next as soon as this starts. And I don't know about you, but I get tingling in the end of my fingers, which is really weird, and tingling in my lips. And I just know. But I haven't had a headache for years. It is literally, I just get the aura. So I now have classic migraine with aura, and that's it. But it's one of the points you were making there I thought was particularly fascinating, was the tuning in, and this leads us into the broader hypothesis now, the tuning in to other information that isn't part of your autobiographical memory that happens. Like, for instance, once when I was in an aura state, I was at work and I was working on the computer, and suddenly I'm looking down at an elderly man reading a newspaper. And I realize I'm sitting in a tree about 20 feet above him. And then I hear a siren. And I look up, and it's this huge square. And I instinctively knew it was somewhere in Latin America, probably Buenos Aires. And there was an ambulance. I can see it in my mind's eye now. And there was an ambulance going along the edge of the square. And then I came to, and it's like a hypnagogic image or a hypnopompic image where you go, well, what the hell was that? And then 2 weeks later, it was even weirder. I'm again working, and I'm looking up through a glass table at an elderly woman with dyed pink hair. And she's got a cup of tea, and she's putting the tea down on the table. And I can see through the table her putting the tea down, as if I'm a cat or something looking up. Now, this intrigued me because I thought, what am I tuning into here? And I experience quite regularly, as I will guarantee you do, and I guarantee a lot of people do, hypnagogic imagery and hypnopompic imagery. So hypnagogic imagery is just before you go to sleep, you will see imagery. Normally it's faces in profile, and they will turn and they may speak to you. They may look at you. And it kind of hits you in your kind of periphery sensorium, because you don't even necessarily appreciate mentally it's happening. You see it, but you don't mentally appreciate. And the moment you put your attention onto it, it fades. So you have to allow it to draw out. Now, I've discussed this with a guy called Andreas Mavromatis, who wrote the definitive book called Hypnagogia. He's a Greek psychologist, and his book is well worth reading. It's absolutely extraordinary. And it explains in great detail how hypnagogic imagery works. But when you're seeing this, you are glimpsing, as if you are tuning into somebody else's life, somebody else's world. Now, one of the major I am going somewhere with this, by the way, I'm not off on a tangent. One of the major criticisms of my work is that people say your hypothesis of life after death cannot accommodate past life, cannot accommodate hypnotic regression to past lives and past life memories. And it can't, because if you're living your life over and over again, you won't have past life memories, because you've only ever been you. But my new developing model, which is within the book Cheating the Ferryman, is I argue, and this, to do the science of this is more difficult, but I argue that there is the Daemon. Well, there's the Eidolon, which lives one life. Then there's the Daemon that lives multiple lives and plays the game till it lives the perfect life. And when it manages to live the perfect life, it moves on to something else, just like Connors does in Groundhog Day when he lives the perfect day.
Yeah, such a good film. I watched that with my kids just the other day.
I interviewed, funnily enough, this is a great aside story. The guy that wrote that book is a guy called Danny Rubin. People turn around and say it's the guy that did Ghostbusters. He didn't. He adapted it from a story written by a guy called Gary Rubin, who's a lecturer at Harvard. And Gary took his idea to the studios, and then the guy from Ghostbusters came along and wrote the story. So it's not his original story. But and again, I've interviewed him, and he explained that he came across like my work, like you did. And he gave a copy of my book to all his friends for Christmas about 15 years ago, because he said, this is the guy that's done the science of Groundhog Day. And in fact, the Russian edition of my first book is called Groundhog Life, which I thought was fascinating. But the idea is that, of course,
can I just say, but just this might be, people might be thinking this, that when you were talking about living one's life again, your life over and over again, you know, the question might be, people are asking, well, where does that lead? And you were saying, until you get a better and better version of your life, until what? Because in Groundhog Day, he relives it over and over again till he just becomes a super awesome person, and then one day he wakes up and it's the next day and his life moves on. So in your hypothesis, where is this all heading?
That is an area I have difficulty in going to, because I genuinely don't know.
Yeah.
What I'd like to believe is that it is akin to, but not the same as, the Buddhist concept, whereby over multiple lives you become an avatar, but not an avatar, a bodhisattva, whereby you have lived the perfect life, and then you can choose to go back into your life to help others. And that would be an advanced person. And of course, this all takes place in what the Tibetan Buddhists would call the bardo state, because of course I argue that, you know, when you have all these multiple lives, it's like the bardo state, And in my new book, I do the anthropology of it and the anthropology of near-death experiences. And it's very equivalent to the Bardo state. So you live the life many, many times till you live the perfect life. Then you're allowed to move on. And I argue you're then allowed to move on to whatever you anticipate will be next. I was talking to a friend earlier on today about this. I call this egregorial life. Again, I'm off on a tangent, one of my other books now, but I have a concept what I call the egregorial, which is the mind-created phaneron, the mind-created reality that is external to us that we project outwards. And it was a guy called, an American philosopher called Charles Peirce that came up with the concept of the phaneron. And remember I was saying before about we collapse the wave function of our anticipations. I believe we do that all through our lives. We are anticipating and creating the world around us, as is everybody else. So it doesn't mean you can influence everything, because everybody's co-creating it. So when you die properly, because remember in the end of the Groundhog lives, at the end, when you got all these hundreds and hundreds, and as Danny Rubin told me, he said his original plan was 6,000 lives, I think, that he was supposed to live 6,000 days and do it again and again and over. So at the end, you then move on to what you anticipate is next. So if your phaneron and your worldview means you go to the Christian heaven, you will experience the Christian heaven. If you believe in reincarnation, you will be reincarnated as somebody else. It's all a fact. And how I explain this is now moving on, because I argue that above the daemon is another consciousness, which I call the uber daemon. And the uber daemon is my equivalent of the Jungian collective unconscious. It is the information field that holds all the data and information for everybody's lives, everybody's multiple lives all through history. And that itself is an entity. And what happens is when you have past lives and you go back into earlier lives in other centuries, you're bypassing demonic consciousness, which is your lives, and you access total consciousness of humanity, the oceanic consciousness. And that consciousness is where all that information is held. I then argue that above that is a concept I call the Godemon. And the Godemon is the Or Ein Sof that you have in the Kabbalah. It's the concept of Brahman, within Hinduism and Vedanta. It's the consciousness that is everything. It is the consciousness field that creates the universe. It is the consciousness field of the universe. And certain advanced human beings can actually access that information field where they have total knowledge. And people talk about this, where they suddenly feel they know everything. And for a split second, it's what Jacob Boehme used to talk about, and his famous line, you could go insane by just looking at a pewter dish. The idea that insanity leads here because our brains cannot take in all that information. But what I argue is that people who have temporal lobe epilepsy can access the demonic consciousness of their own lives, but also can leach in to the uber daemon. But when you get schizophrenia, you're accessing the mental capacity and the information field of the uber daemon and maybe even the Godemon. And it literally drives you crazy because the information is just flooding in from everywhere and you cannot handle it. Again, Raynor Johnson, who was an English physicist who became schizophrenic when he was older, he came up with this wonderful analogy. And he said, becoming schizophrenic is like you've lived your life in one of those Irish round towers. And you've lived in the top of the tower and you have 5 windows that you look through, which are your 5 senses. When you acquire schizophrenia, it's like you've found a trapdoor in the roof and you've climbed through and you're looking out at reality as it really is. And of course, we know from autism, we know this is the major problem autistic children have. It's called the wild world syndrome. It's because the information is coming in so great, they go hysterical, they scream, they shout. It's a guy, there's an American psychiatrist who's come up with this hypothesis called the hyperworld syndrome. And I argue then the same happens with Alzheimer's disease. What happens in Alzheimer's disease, as you know, is that the amyloid, the neurons of the brain are being destroyed by things called amyloid plaques, which get in the brain, and they literally explode the neurons. And by exploding the neurons, I argue they're opening that consciousness to a much wider information field. And that's why people, when they have Alzheimer's, they start to be rather like people who have autism. They start to have other skills. My mother, it was uncanny. And again, if anybody's interested, and you should read this with your mother, there's a friend of mine who's written a book called The Gift of Alzheimer's, a lady called Maggie Latourelle. And she applies a lot of my models to her work. The experience is her mother was psychic. Her mother was seeing things that were happening miles away. She was seeing her dead daughter. Her mind was just melding out of her brain and accommodating everything. So now we have a whole worldview that everything is consciousness. Everything is made out of data. Everything is binary code. Everything is literally information. So what we think is a physical reality out there. We know, for instance, that the chair you're sitting on is 99.999999999996 empty space. And the empty space that's there, the physical bits within that are quarks and electrons. And quarks are point particles. There are 6 of them, and they're point particles, which means they have no extension in space. The other objects, electrons, are the same. They're point particles. So however much you zoom in on them, you never see a sphere. But the other objects that are in there are fields, which is also out there. And fields are created by things called bosons. And the classic boson is the photon of light. Now, so everything you see out there is literally because photons of light are bouncing off objects. A photon of light can only ever travel at the speed of light. It cannot travel any slower. And it's a point particle. So A, it has no extension in space, and B, from its point of view, there is no time. Because as you know, from Einstein's theory of relativity and his theory of time, in his general theory of relativity, if you're traveling at the speed of light, you have zero mass, which a photon has, which means it's not physical, and everything is a permanent now for it. So there could be a photon of light that left a quasar 3 billion years ago that hits the eye if you're looking through a telescope or whatever, and you see the light coming from a quasar. As far as that light is concerned, it's the same second, millisecond, when it left the quasar. And these odd objects are the things that create everything around us. What is out there is not what we think it is. And as Bill Hicks said, matter is just energy slowed down. And we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is one consciousness, which is what Erwin Schrödinger argued. And we are just watered down versions of that. We are waves from that singular consciousness. And it goes through from the Eidolon to the Daemon to the Uber-Daemon to the Godemon. So this model can literally, I can explain absolutely everything. Now I'm either completely mad or my model works. And so far, nobody has been able to come along and criticize my science. My science is watertight. Everything I've just told you is based upon academic work, academic reviews, peer-reviewed papers, and absolute research.
Your description at the end there reminds me of the tantric philosophical description of consciousness. How can one consciousness be all of these different things, seemingly different things? That water can be a vapor, a liquid, and a solid in ice, but it's all water. They're completely different. So, you know, ice is so different to steam, for example, and liquid, but all the same thing. And there's something else you said. Might come back to me. Well, what I'll describe this schizophrenic
Yeah, please.
Episode I had, because this is interesting in relation to the Daemon. Again, this is before I'd read your book. So there've been a couple of times in my life, and I think this is cannabis induced. I mean, I've got a lot of experience with a wide variety of psychedelics: ayahuasca, DMT, ketamine, mushrooms, LSD, and these kind of things. And nothing has taken me, to this kind of schizophrenic edge like cannabis has. So I think cannabis, some people are fine with it and some people aren't, and I'm just one of those people I'm not okay with it. So there were sort of 2 5-year periods where I smoked a lot of cannabis, sort of daily. And after about 5 years, both times I had a kind of schizophrenic episode. I had about a 15-year break of no cannabis in between those 2 periods. The first time, so this was in my early 20s. The TV and radio and stuff started talking to me about how I was going to die and all sorts of weird, nasty coded messages. And just fortunately, I moved out of London, the social group I was in, and that I just stopped smoking cannabis, and that for 15 years, and I was fine. Never came back. But then I had this other experience, which again was a couple of years ago, and it was just after I had the seizure. And I'd been ill, so I hadn't smoked, and I was vaporizing cannabis at the time every evening. It's a kind of like evening ritual. And I'd been ill, so I hadn't vaped any cannabis for probably 5 days or something like that. Couldn't sleep one night, and I thought, I'm just going to get really stoned and knock myself out, because I just, it was late and I just wanted to sleep. So because I hadn't had any for a few days, you kind of build up this tolerance to cannabis. If you take a few days off, you can get really, really stoned on a usual amount. So I was really quite high, and I was watching this YouTube video with my wife, and there was this cut scene that happened twice in the video, and it was just like water going down a waterfall. It was quite a distinctive cut scene, and it happened twice, and I was like, oh no, because I'd had the seizure fairly recently, and I thought, oh, here we go, I'm about to have another seizure. Basically, I think I had a kind of a panic attack. I mean, as you were saying, about your fingers tingling, my fingers started tingling, my hands were tingling, and I was very concerned I was going to have another seizure. And funnily enough, the next day, my wife, when I was able to tell my wife, about all these things that had happened this evening I'm about to describe, she said, oh no, that cutscene actually did happen twice in the thing. So I didn't actually have deja vu. This damn thing did actually happen twice, and it just caused this, reaction in me. But what happened was, and everything. So as I say, I've had a lot of experience with different psychedelics in my life. I sound like a totally crazy guy, but anyone who knows me well will probably say they know me to be a very, very grounded, sane and earthy person. So for anyone listening to this who doesn't know me, which is probably most people. So, I was familiar with non-ordinary states of consciousness, but this was unlike these other type of experiences. And what happened was everything got collapsed into complete synchronicity. So anyone who was speaking, it was like this. And when I later read about Philip K. Dick and his Valis thing,
I was
I was like,
thinking
oh my God. So he,
because I've written a biography of Philip K.
yes,
Dick.
I do. Yeah, I do. So this, what I was described at the time was an alien. I couldn't talk about this at the time because I was able to describe it, the next day, and because I was just completely overwhelmed by this experience. An alien intelligence was talking to me through other people. So my wife or anyone, when they opened their mouth to speak, it wasn't them anymore. It was this alien, this other intelligence was literally talking to me in plain English through their voice. And if I watched anything on YouTube or TV or my phone, it was this alien intelligence, this other intelligence, like call it God or an alien. It felt like an alien intelligence, something other, was talking to me through synchronicity symbolism, through the video. Any audio I listened to, any music, or to calm me down, my wife put on this kind of guided meditation thing on Spotify that we put on for our kids. This guy, the talking of that, every action anybody did, any sensation in my body, it was like all phenomena had been collapsed into communication, direct communication with this other entity that sometimes was talking to me in plain English, but most of the communication was just through synchronistic symbolism. I mean, I can't describe it any better than that, I'm afraid. To begin with, I was fighting it, and it was very unpleasant. I was panicking, and then I thought, well, what if this? Okay, well, this clearly isn't working. I'm working myself into a state. What if this actually is happening? So there is another intelligence, some alien intelligence, God or whatever this thing is, literally talking to me. Let's just go with that. Like, I was thinking about shamanism. I was thinking, well, if I'm having a shamanic experience here, what would a shaman do? Well, they'd be a shaman. They'd be like, okay, well, this is real. I'm going to just go with it, see what's happening. And then when I stopped resisting, it actually turned into really quite an amazing experience that was very profound and wonderful. But basically, this entity was guiding me through this initiation, which I couldn't really understand. I just had to give into it, basically. And this went on for, I don't know, about 3 hours, something like that. Then I fell asleep and I woke up feeling okay, but really shaken the next day. Immediately stopped cannabis. That's it, done for the rest of my life. Haven't smoked cannabis for a year and a half or something. And I don't intend to ever again. But I woke up and the next day I was like, I went right to the edge of madness there. And, it was not, I didn't want to go mad. I've got young kids. So I was like, it was a very interesting experience. But the thing that was interesting about it, as compared with other ones, which made me think about schizophrenia, was that there wasn't the expansive sense of, say, if you are tripping on ayahuasca or something, you have this, or DMT, you have this, you perceive vast spaces, millions of miles across, kind of thing. This was very, very claustrophobic and two-dimensional. It was just, there was nothing in the universe other than me and this other entity. Nothing else existed. So it felt very, I don't know, egocentric would be the word that came to me at the time. So I've got friends that have had schizophrenia or do have schizophrenia, and I was describing this and it was all very familiar to them. I think that's That's about it. But you know, I recognised it had the same flavour as this thing that happened to me in my 20s, which was like, okay, well, I know what's happening here. I just, um, yeah. So there was that experience, and when I read your book about the Daemon talking to people and communicating to people, I was like, oh, whoa, this is kind of, it felt like very much like that. But it was this was not a clear communication. They basically the communication was, you're undergoing something here which you can't understand. You just got to let go and trust this, basically. So it wasn't like I got specific information about anything like the future or a precognitive thing.
Well, to me, one of the things here is a concept that I envisaged or discussed many years ago, what I call the cacodemon. And the argument that the daemon is altruistic, or the daemon has your own best interests at heart, we've no way of knowing. It might be morally completely ambivalent. And there are certain daemons, for instance, I always used to think about the fact that when the Stauffenberg plot took place for the assassination of Hitler in 1944, I think it was, from Klaus von Stauffenberg, and Stauffenberg placed the bomb in a particular location in the Wolfslair or wherever it was, and Hitler, quite by chance, stood up and kicked, and his leg kicked the bomb behind a pillar. So when the bomb went off about 5 minutes later, the blast was taken by the pillar and didn't kill Hitler.
That's crazy.
So there you have a scenario of, was that Hitler's daemon ensuring the survival of its Eidolon? But that was not to the world's interests at all. But it wasn't being altruistic, it was being totally egoistic in its approach, but it was still ensuring its own survival within the game. The argument, like, is DNA sentient? And if DNA, and I have discussed this in one of my books, if DNA is sentient, have you read the Cosmic Serpent, Jeremy Narby?
No.
Okay, it's a very interesting book on his experiences with DMT and ayahuasca. And he argues that a lot of the symbolism when you take DMT, particularly the snakes, are actually symbolic of and are actual entities that are effectively DNA. And it's the DNA communicating with us. Now, of course, we know from the work of people like Richard Dawkins and the Blind Watchmaker and various other things, that we effectively are carriers of DNA. We are the machines that allow DNA to be immortal. In other words, DNA needs us to continue existing in one way or another. Now, could again, the machine elves that Terence McKenna talks about, are these again forms of sentient DNA that we see? And I was reminded when you were talking earlier on there about 5-MeO DMT, the Cenarian toad and the effects that has. And associates of mine who have taken both DMT and 5-MeO DMT very much describe that whereas you seem to access the daemon during DMT or maybe even the uber daemon, when you take 5-MeO, you lose your whole sense of individuality and you become a singular entity. You realize that you are part of a much greater something that is you, and that we are all differentials from that same huge sentience, whatever that may be. And a friend of mine was saying it took him ages to come down from our 5-MeO. It really changed his worldview totally. So
I interviewed a friend of mine on this podcast, well, maybe 3 years ago, called Donald Clark. If anyone is listening wants to go back to that, but he took him about 2 years to recover from 5-MeO DMT. It's not something I've tried. Before I die, it's on the to-do list, but I'm not in a rush.
Well, this is where it gets very interesting, because in my new book, I say the foreword's being written by Dr. Michael, and Pascal did a fascinating wrote a fascinating academic paper last year where he interviewed Ibn Alexander,
Hmm.
the NDE, the doctor that
Yeah.
had meningitis and had a full near-death experience.
Proof of life
Proof
of
of life,
proof
yeah,
of yeah. Was it called proof of life or
proof of heaven or
proof of
something.
heaven? Proof of heaven. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, because he was interesting because he was a complete skeptic and didn't believe in life after death or near-death experiences. But what is fascinating is that Pascal did some research and discovered that he had also taken 5-MeO. So here we had a perfect person who'd had a near-death experience who'd taken 5-MeO DMT.
So
And
Ibn Alexander had done 5-MeO DMT
correct, it's in
before
my
having
new,
the.
so this is in my new book. And
Wow.
the comparisons between his experiences, he's in the unique position of being able to compare the two.
Mm.
And it's really interesting. Well worth getting hold of Pascal's paper on this. Um, but very interesting. He also, Pascal also has another paper he wrote with David Luke, also on somebody else who'd taken DMT and has had like the similarities with DMT and these experiences. Because I
But I
argue,
just want to say just quickly that I've read Ibn Alexander's book.
mm,
When I read that, so I have drunk ayahuasca a few times
mm,
and smoked DMT. When I read his description of his near death experience, it was like it just sounded so like a DMT
oh,
inspired thing. I was like, "Whoa, this is yeah, you know."
his whole
Mm,
the whole incident of the where he's in the mud, where he
mm,
comes to and he's bubbling in mud. He's like an entity inside mud.
mm.
And this kind of visceral, stinking, foul world he finds himself in. And then he rises above this, and he
Yeah,
has that bizarre sequence where he's on the wings of a butterfly,
yeah,
and
yeah.
he meets his dead sister,
Hmm.
and he meets initially this beautiful young woman who has the most startling blue eyes, who talks to him. And I don't know if you know the story, because then when he came to,
Yeah,
he subsequently discussed with his parents this person, and he discovered he had this younger sister who died
yeah.
that he never knew about, or an elder sister who had startling blue eyes.
Mm.
And this very much convinced him that whatever he was experiencing, it was extraordinary. And I even helped. I had a chapter on his experience in one of my earlier books, and Eben actually proofread it for me to make sure I'd got the nuances correct. Now, these things are evident that there's such a linkage between the DMT experience, and again, I have a whole chapter in the new book on DMT entities and UFO entities and UFO abductions. And I have the wonderful opportunity in 6 weeks' time to be doing work with Whitley Strieber. Whitley wrote the introduction to one of my books, but I've never met him, but I will be meeting him at Contact in the Desert. And also with a guy called, oh geez, they made a movie of it called Fire in the Sky. He was a logger up in Oregon somewhere, I think, and he got abducted. Um, and I'm going to be doing some work with him as well. And it'd be interesting to discuss the similarities with alien experiences and alien encounters, because I think the beings are identical. They're the same beings. They're just manifesting in a different way. And I call these egregorials again. And I believe that they are entities that have independence of us, but don't. They need us to come into existence. They need our fear, for want of a better term, to manifest themselves in this reality. Which is very intriguing. And also, I believe that the near-death experience is directly facilitated by DMT. For example, are you aware of the work of Jimo Borjigin, the University of Michigan?
No.
Okay, Jimo Borjigin is a neuroscientist, and in I think it was 2017, they were euthanizing rats. They were actually testing rats and the brain patterns and what chemicals released in the brain of rats, and they killed them. and the brain then died. And then about 15 seconds after the brain had died, after they'd been beheaded, the brain started again. Massive activity all over the brain. And they believed this was the near-death experience. And then they discovered something extraordinary, because doing a series of other experiments, they, for the first time, discovered DMT in the brain of a live rat. For the first time, they discovered DMT in the brain. So when people turn around and say DMT has been found in the human body in various places, yes, it has, but it's now in the brain.
Mm.
And not only that, but there seems to be a direct linkage between a release of DMT at the point of death and the near-death experience. And again, in my new book, I have an extensive, I mean, I don't know if you know, in my new book, I've read virtually every single academic paper that's been written on near-death experiences for the last 50 years. I've read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And some of the research that's been done. And again, I think I'm the only person that's actually drawing in from all these different sources the information. And again, the world doesn't listen to me, because I don't know why the world is not interested in what I'm writing about, because I've got now in the new book, I've got probably 40 pages of references, 40 pages of academic papers that people can go back and read and make up their own mind as to whether the conclusions I'm coming to. I very much work upon the Marcello Trui argument of extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And I believe that is the case. We have to, you can't just make these statements, you've got to prove them. And yet there's other authors out there who make these wild, weird statements, and the books sell by the shed load. And I've always thought, what I should have done is pretended I was channeling this all from the planet Tharg.
Yeah. Yeah.
To me, and I was channeling it all,
Yeah.
because then everybody would believe me, and I'd have sold shed loads of books and just made half of it up. But such is the world. That's how the
Yeah.
world works. And I still like to believe that I have the academic credibility in my work, that people cannot argue with my point of view. They can't. I have all the information I need at my fingertips.
Mm.
And because I have a very weird memory, I'm not a very easy person to argue with, because I can normally close my eyes and remember the paper and the quote and everything
Yeah.
else.
I have picked that up. You are definitely a memory mutant.
A walking Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is rather weird. And
So we're just because we only got a small amount of time left. I wanted to get this in that. So, we've talked about all of this stuff, all of these hypotheses you've come up with. How has this changed the way you live? So, I know, for example, I've looked on your Facebook a little bit and listened to your conversations, and I know synchronicity is something that is quite a big thing for you. And my question about that is, I've had quite a lot of synchronicities in my life, but I've also know people that have kind of gone really deep into synchronicity to the point where it's become ludicrous, in my opinion. I mean, I that is a value judgment on my behalf. I think there's a level at which you can just become a genuinely mad person with synchronicity. The other thing is that how has this understanding of the Daemon how does that inform your life? Has that changed your life in the sense of the way you live day to day? I'm chucking a few things out here, and also this thing about the Groundhog Day thing, living the perfect life, cheating the ferryman. I mean, what's the journey been like for you in terms of who've you become as a result of this, and how's your life changed?
that's an excellent question, and I need to unpack it in various ways. The first point I always make is that, do I believe in Cheating the Ferryman? Do I believe in the Daemon Eidolon dyad? Do I believe in the Huxleyan spectrum? For me, they're intellectual exercises. For me, they are things that the evidence seems to suggest that this is a model that has sense to it and it has support. To say I believe in it, I don't believe in anything, in the sense I'm not a believer, I'm not religious, I don't have any ulterior motives in terms of my writing. Also, I'm also incredibly willing that if somebody comes along and points out that something I've said is wrong or incorrect, I just amend it, because I'm a seeker after truth. I'm not trying to prove anything. So that's the first thing. But then we start getting into how has it affected my life? Well, in very strange ways, in that there's things that have happened in my life that I cannot explain, that have evidence to me of my own daemon. And from the introduction in the book, I have a section called Footprints in the Snow. And by that, I mean evidence of the existence of my own daemon. And there were two things that happened that I immediately recall that still shake me to this day, because it is just extraordinary. When I was researching the first book, I needed to understand about mitochondria. I was particularly interested in the cell structures and mitochondrial DNA, the way in which it carries through the female line. Now, I then went to my bookcase because I needed to reference mitochondria. And I thought to myself, the only person I know that's going to have written anything about mitochondria is Richard Dawkins. And I have all of Richard Dawkins' books. I then looked at the books and I thought, yeah, probably, let's check. I think he's probably going to have written about mitochondria, probably in The Blind Watchmaker. This is my copy of The Blind Watchmaker. I opened the book and I suddenly noticed something I never do. I never dog-ear pages. I went through the book and I noticed that one page had been dog-eared. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I then remembered, and suddenly I had a memory flashback, and I remembered when I read this book, and it was on a beach in Greece in around about, I don't know, the early 1990s. And my earlier self had got up, and my daemon, for no apparent reason, had dog-eared that page for me in the future to find it. Because I read down the page and look, mitochondria, of which I've now highlighted. I then went to the back of the book. It's the only time that Richard Dawkins ever mentions mitochondria in any of his books. So my earlier self had gone, I'm going to show you that I'm going to guide you, and I'm going to leave you a clue for your future self to find. Then I got so interested in synchronicities and strange events that I was interested in writing up about things. And I got very interested in time. And I needed to get hold of a book called Man and Time, written by J.B. Priestley. Now, as you know, I've written a book on J.B. Priestley subsequently. So this was 1999. Couldn't find a copy of the book. So I went to my library in Horsham. And I went to Horsham Library and asked whether they could order a copy of Man and Time for me from any of the local libraries. They said, there is no copy of it in West Sussex. We're going to have to order it from the British Library in Boston Spa. We'll put an order in for it, and then we'll let you know when the book has arrived. So a few weeks go by, and then I get a phone call from the library. The book's arrived. Do you want to come and pick it up? So I go in and I pick it up. Arbitrary, one day I just go and pick it up. Leave the copy. This is my own copy of the book, by the way, not the original of the one I'm talking about. I then left it in my study. And then one night I'm going to bed. And something in my head said, pick up Man and Time. So I pick up Man and Time. Now, as you can see, this book has got 319 pages in it. So there's 319 pages in this book. I start flicking through the pages at random. So then I open the page, and for some reason, I stop at page 91, which is this page here. Okay?
Yeah.
My wife's sitting in bed next to me, and I start reading this at random. So it's a random page, random day, and I start reading it. And Priestley is trying to explain how time and light and time travel. So you're seeing a star as it was. This is what he writes. This is clearly illustrated by a figure and an explanatory based on by James A. Coleman in his Relativity for the Layman. Now, this book was written in 1964, and Relativity for the book that he's quoting was written in 1957. This is the quote that Priestley took from Coleman. This figure shows the Earth, the star Betelgeuse in the constellation Orion the Hunter, and Aldebaran in Taurus the Bull. Betelgeuse and Aldebaran are 352 light years respectively from the Earth. Also, Aldebaran is about 200 light years from Betelgeuse, or Betelgeuse. Now, suppose there's a blowout on Orion on the night of March the 17th, 2000, caused by Betelgeuse exploding. I turned around to my wife and I said, "What month is it?" And she said, "It's March." I said, "What date is it?" And she's looking at me as if I'm completely crazy. And she said, "It's the 17th. I said, "What year is it?" She said, "It's 2000, you know that." I said, "You're a mathematician. Can you explain to me how all the variables of me ordering the book, them getting the book back to me from Boston Spa in Yorkshire, them then having the book for 3 or 4 days at the library, me deciding to go in on one random day to pick the book up, bringing the book back, leaving it in my study for random for days on end, then arbitrarily picking it up tonight on the night of March the 17th, 2000. And then a random page opens to give me the exact date and the time. That to me was extraordinary. So the next few days, we're in Cheltenham visiting my brother-in-law. We're in a bookshop. And my wife turns around to me. She goes, "I'm fed up with all these synchronicities you're talking about." She said, "What book are you looking for?" Second-hand bookshop, books piled everywhere. And I said, "I'm looking for a biography of William Blake is what I need." And she went, "Oh, for Christ's sake." And it was in her eye line, a book by William Blake. She picked the book, she threw it across the room and stormed out. Now, that is the kind of thing that really I find are significant synchronicities. They're significant, they mean something, and they're supplying something. And then you get the really weird thing of 1111. Now, I've argued in my books that 1111, the reason that people see 1111 all the time is it's a group of vertical lines. You know, so you just notice it's not that weird. Until my wife pointed out, and she said, "You keep seeing 1111 everywhere." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "You don't see the main thing, do you?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "What's the title of your book in Dutch?" 111111. It means life after life after life in Dutch.
Wow.
Then this weekend, it was my 70th birthday on Friday. We went up to my old university, Warwick. We booked into the hotel, and the room that we originally were booked into, we couldn't get into because the door was locked. The lock wouldn't work. So they changed our room. They moved us to room 11. We then go outside to get the bus to the university because we decided we wouldn't drive in. We get the bus the next morning. Bus number 11. We then go into the university, and I decide to go to the library and just have a look at the library. And I wanted to take a photograph of the staircase in the library. As I pick up my phone, take the photograph of the library, I see the time, 11 minutes past 11. And I'm going, is this just, I'm noticing it? Or is it more? And I genuinely don't know. And I find it fascinating. But finally, has my idea of the Daemon and living your life over and over again influenced my life? Yes. I'm now very aware of people that come into my life, that are people that have come into my life over the last few years that I knew were going to be important to me. And I knew it by just seeing them. Like there was somebody, I was speaking at an event, and there was a young girl at the event, and I knew she'd speak to me. And she's now become a really good friend of mine. And it's these things that happen that makes you realize you've done this before and your daemon is guiding you. You've just got to listen to the clues, to the hints to get you through. And I genuinely believe that is what is happening. Whether it's real, whether it's genuine, I don't know, but it works for me. But then again, if this universe is my universe and I'm creating it and I'm collapsing the wave function of this particular universe, it's not at all surprising that I can influence it, because it's my universe. And you're part of my Phaneron.
Well, it's been a real delight to speak to you, Tony. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been really, really good. We must meet up sometime. Really good.
Yeah.
And you must get along to Breaking Convention.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, I need to get there.
You'd love it. You would adore it. They now do it at Essex University of, wasn't the University of Greenwich. Last year it was at the University of Exeter, and I think they're probably going to start doing it at the University of Exeter. You get hundreds and hundreds of people turn up.
Yeah.
You get all the real major lecturers, people from around the world speak there.
Yeah. And I think, for those listening, Breaking Conventions has a lot to do with psychedelics, but there's other stuff plugged into it.
Totally.
And I think, one of the things about your work, I've also been very much into meditation for 30 years or so, but it's the psychedelics stuff is what really connects with your work, and there's a kind of recognition there. And one of the last things I wanted to say is I'd written this down to say this is, this is related to memory. You were talking about memory a lot earlier in our conversation. And one of the kind of hallmarks of a psychedelic experience is, I believe that the word they use is anamnesis. Of
the loss of the reliving of the regaining of memory.
Yeah, it's like, holy shit, this is familiar. You're having the most bizarre experience. If this is, a substance you've never tried before, or you've never tried psychedelics before, your very first experience, you're like, oh my God, it's the no reference points to anything you've ever experienced before in your life, but at the very same, it's a complete paradox. Same time, you're like, this is so familiar.
It's pure Platonic, isn't it? I mean, it's Plato that first came up with the concept of the loss of forgetting. And of course, Philip K. Dick discusses this extensively in his exegesis. And it is a fascinating idea, and I think it's very much the equivalent of drinking the waters of the Lethe, the river of forgetting. There's is it Memnosone, the goddess of memory, and myself. There's somebody you need to get on this show, funnily enough, is a friend of mine called Sarah Janes, who's written the most wonderful book on ancient Greece and memory training and everything else as well, and dream training. She does dream work, and she's going to be doing an event this summer in Athens, and she did one last year as well. Really, really fascinating. It'd be well worth. There's a number of people that I think that probably you might be interested in getting on.
Yeah, please do email me them, a contact detail.
Will do, because they're all part of the Breaking Convention circle as well. We all meet at convention, which happens every 2 years, and I can introduce you to a lot of very interesting people there.
Great, wonderful. For just at the end, your website for anyone who wants to find out more about your work.
AnthonyPeake.com.
Yeah, and Peake is Peake.
As in Mervyn, or Tim Peake, the astronaut. But
right.
Yes, wonderful.
All right, thank you so much, Anthony.
Okay, Ralph.
Yeah.
Lovely speaking to you. Okay, see ya.
I made all the music that I use in my podcasts. If you'd like to hear more, please go to soundcloud.com and look up Ralph Cree.